The church was wrapped in a silence so thick it felt almost solid, pressing against the ribs of everyone seated inside, as if grief itself had taken a physical form. Sunlight slipped through the tall stained glass windows, breaking into shards of blue and gold that rested on the polished wooden coffin at the front, making it look deceptively peaceful, almost holy. The millionaire sat in the first pew, his spine rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached, his expensive black suit hanging on him like borrowed armor that could not protect him from the emptiness hollowing out his chest. His mother had been declared dead only the night before, her body removed swiftly, efficiently, with clinical certainty, and now here he was, surrounded by murmured condolences and sympathetic glances that felt useless, distant, unreal. He stared at the coffin without blinking, terrified that if he looked away for even a second, she would truly vanish from the world. The priest's voice floated through the air, steady and practiced, speaking of eternal rest and divine mercy, but the words slid past him, failing to reach whatever part of him still felt alive. At the back of the church, unnoticed by most, stood the cleaning lady, her hands wrapped around the handle of her cart as if it were an anchor. She had arrived early, as she always did, intending to quietly prepare the space after the mourners left, but the moment she stepped inside, something had twisted sharply in her chest. Her eyes kept drifting to the coffin against her will, her breath growing shallow as an unease she couldn't name crept under her skin. She told herself she was tired, that long nights and harder days were playing tricks on her senses. Yet as the service continued, she heard it, a sound so faint it barely existed, like a whisper trapped beneath layers of wood. She tilted her head, listening again, her heart beginning to race. It wasn't crying, wasn't movement, but a rhythm, irregular and fragile, something she had learned to recognize years ago while caring for the sick and dying, when life clung stubbornly to the body long after hope had faded. Her palms grew damp, her mind screaming at her to stay still, to not make a scene, to not embarrass herself in front of people who would never listen to someone like her. The sound came again, softer this time, and fear exploded into certainty. Without fully deciding to do so, she pushed her cart forward, the wheels squeaking loudly against the stone floor, slicing through the solemn hush like a blade. Heads turned. Whispers rippled outward. The priest paused mid-sentence. The millionaire stiffened, irritation flashing across his grief-stricken face as he saw the woman approaching the coffin with urgency written all over her posture. She stopped inches from it, pressed her ear against the smooth wood, and felt her stomach drop. There it was again, weak, uneven, unmistakably alive. She pulled back, her eyes wide, her voice trembling yet clear as she spoke words that seemed impossible in this place of final goodbyes. "Sir, take her out of there," she said, looking directly at the millionaire now, ignoring the gasps and protests erupting around her. "She's not dead." Outrage burst from the funeral director, sharp and offended, while several mourners rose from their seats in shock. The priest raised his hands, demanding order, insisting this was inappropriate, cruel even. The millionaire stood slowly, fury and pain colliding inside him like colliding storms. How dare this woman disrupt his mother's funeral, his last chance to honor her? His mouth opened, ready to unleash words that would have her removed immediately. But then he saw her face properly, not mocking, not hysterical, but pale with fear and conviction, as if she were risking something far greater than humiliation. She knocked lightly on the coffin, her knuckles trembling, then stepped back, giving him space, her gaze never leaving his. The room seemed to hold its breath, time stretching unbearably thin. Memories of his mother flooded him, her quiet wisdom, her insistence on listening to intuition when logic failed, her belief that truth often arrived disguised as inconvenience. His chest tightened, against reason, against protocol, against the crushing weight of public expectation. His hand lifted slightly. "Open it," he said, his voice hoarse, cracking the moment in half. Chaos erupted instantly, but as the lid was forced open and his mother's chest rose in a weak, desperate gasp, the church shattered into screams, prayers, and sobs, the sound of life returning echoing louder than any hymn that had been sung that day. The hospital corridor was drenched in harsh white light, a place where hope and despair passed each other like strangers who refused to make eye contact. The millionaire stood outside the emergency room, his back against the cold wall, his hands shaking despite his effort to keep them still, the events at the church replaying in his mind with terrifying clarity. Only hours ago, he had been preparing to say goodbye forever, and now the word forever felt fragile, unreliable, as doctors rushed in and out with clipped voices and urgent expressions. Through the narrow glass window, he could see his mother lying motionless on the bed, her skin pale beneath the glow of monitors, tubes trailing from her like thin lifelines. Every beep of the machine stabbed at his chest, each one a reminder that she was balanced on the edge between being here and being gone. A physician finally stepped toward him, explaining in careful, measured tones that her condition was rare, that certain neurological states could mimic death so convincingly even experienced professionals could be deceived. That time had nearly stolen something irreplaceable. He nodded without truly hearing, his mind caught between guilt and relief, haunted by the thought that his wealth, his influence, his unquestioned trust in authority had almost sealed her fate. Down the hall, seated quietly on a plastic chair that seemed too small for her exhaustion, the cleaning lady waited, her eyes fixed on the floor, her shoulders slightly hunched as if she expected to be scolded or dismissed at any moment. Nurses passed her without a second glance, and she shrank further into herself, suddenly unsure whether she had done the right thing or merely caused chaos that would soon be blamed on her. When the doctor walked away, the millionaire noticed her again, truly noticed her, and something tightened painfully in his throat. He walked toward her, the sound of his polished shoes echoing too loudly in the quiet corridor, and stopped in front of her without quite knowing what to say. She looked up, startled, ready to apologize, ready to explain herself all over again. But he spoke first, his voice low and rough with emotion. "You saved her," he said simply, and the words seemed to surprise them both. She shook her head faintly, insisting she only listened, only did what anyone should have done, but her hands betrayed her, trembling in her lap. He asked how she had known, and she told him about years spent caring for people who hovered at the edge of life, about learning the difference between silence and stillness, about the sound that had refused to let her walk away from the coffin. As she spoke, he realized how little he knew about the people who moved invisibly through his world, cleaning after celebrations, erasing traces of grief and joy alike, never invited to speak unless something went wrong. Hours slipped by as night settled in, the hospital growing quieter but no less tense. He paced, sat, stood again, the weight of waiting grinding down his nerves, while the cleaning lady remained where she was, refusing offers to leave, as though staying close was a promise she had made to herself. Near dawn, a nurse emerged with a tired smile and told them his mother was stable, that she had responded to treatment, that there was hope. The millionaire felt his knees weaken, relief crashing through him so fiercely he had to grip the wall to stay upright. He turned instinctively toward the woman who had started this impossible chain of events, and without thinking, he reached out and pulled her into an embrace, his composure finally breaking as tears soaked into the fabric of her worn uniform. She froze for a heartbeat, then gently placed a hand on his back, murmuring soft words meant to steady rather than celebrate. When they were allowed into the room, his mother lay with her eyes closed, her breathing still shallow but undeniably present, her hand warm in his when he held it. As if sensing him, her eyelids fluttered open, confusion clouding her gaze before recognition softened it, and she squeezed his fingers weakly, anchoring him to the reality that she was truly there. The cleaning lady stood near the door, tears silently tracing lines down her face, her relief quiet and profound. Over the following days, reporters circled the story hungrily, calling it a miracle, a scandal, a failure of procedure, but he shielded her from the noise, insisting she be left alone. He sat with her during visiting hours, listening as she shared pieces of her life. Losses endured without ceremony, love given without reward, resilience learned the hard way. And with each story, something inside him shifted. He saw how close he had come not only to losing his mother, but to losing the chance to understand the quiet bravery that existed beyond his privileged world. By the time his mother finally spoke in full sentences again, thanking the woman who had heard her when no one else did, The millionaire understood that survival had changed them all, binding them together in a way that wealth, grief, and gratitude alone could never fully explain. Weeks later, the house that had once felt like a carefully curated museum of success was filled with unfamiliar sounds of life returning to its corners, soft laughter drifting down hallways that had long echoed only with footsteps and silence. Morning light poured through wide windows, warming the polished floors where shadows used to linger, and the millionaire stood near the doorway of his mother's room, watching her sit upright in a wheelchair, a blanket draped over her knees, her hair brushed neatly, as if reclaiming dignity one small gesture at a time. Each breath she took still felt like a gift that could be taken back without warning, and he found himself counting them unconsciously, afraid that certainty would tempt fate. The cleaning lady stood beside her, no longer clutching a cart or keeping her eyes lowered, but moving with calm confidence, adjusting the blanket, offering water, speaking in a voice that was gentle yet unafraid. Their connection had grown quietly over the weeks of recovery, forged not by obligation but by shared survival, and as he watched them talk, he realized how profoundly the meaning of his home had shifted. It was no longer defined by expensive art or guarded privacy, but by the fragile presence of a woman who should have been gone and the unexpected strength of another who had refused to let her disappear. One afternoon, as sunlight painted the room in gold, his mother reached for the cleaning lady's hand and held it with surprising firmness, her eyes bright with emotion that words struggled to hold. She thanked her not as a benefactor might, but as a mother who understood how close she had come to never seeing her son again, her voice trembling with sincerity. The cleaning lady's eyes filled, and she nodded, swallowing tears, admitting softly that she had been terrified that day, that she had nearly stayed silent, nearly convinced herself she had imagined everything. The millionaire listened, his chest tightening at the thought of how easily fear could have stolen this second chance. Later that evening, he sat alone in his study, surrounded by contracts and documents that once defined his power, and realized they felt strangely small now. Gratitude demanded more than words, more than charity offered from a distance. The next morning, he spoke to her plainly, asking her to stay, not as someone hidden behind uniforms and schedules, but as a valued caretaker with fair pay, respect, and a voice in how things were done. She hesitated, searching his face for condescension or pity, and when she found neither, she agreed on one condition, that she would never be treated as invisible again. He accepted without argument, knowing that promise would reshape not just his household, but his understanding of worth. As days turned into months, the story that had once threatened to become a spectacle faded from the headlines, replaced by quieter routines that mattered more. His mother regained strength slowly, each step of victory celebrated with smiles rather than applause, and the house filled with the gentle rhythm of ordinary life, shared meals, conversations that lingered, laughter that surprised them all. One afternoon, sitting together in the garden, his mother looked at her son with a seriousness that made him straighten despite himself. She told him that wealth had protected them from many hardships, but it had nearly blinded him to the people who truly sustained the world, those who noticed what others ignored. He nodded, humbled, understanding that the coffin had not only held his mother's body, but a lesson he would never forget. When he thought back to that moment in the church, the terror still clenched his stomach, yet it was softened now by a profound sense of purpose. He had begun funding training programs for hospital staff and caregivers, ensuring awareness of rare conditions that mimic death. But more importantly, he made a point of listening to employees, to strangers, to the quiet voices that did not shout for attention. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep reds and purples, he watched his mother and the woman who had saved her sit side by side, their heads bent together in conversation, and felt a peace he had never known in all his years of success. He understood then that the greatest transformation had not been his mother's return from the edge of death, but his own awakening to the value of courage that spoke up when it was easier to stay silent. The memory of the coffin would always remain, a dark and terrifying image, but it would forever be linked to the moment when a simple act of listening changed the course of 3 lives, turning what should have been an ending into a beginning that felt, at last, profoundly and unmistakably alive.